Welcome.
A notable welcome to all you music lovers.
To
Journey
to the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back
Your host.
And our dad.
Brian.
Frasier.
Oh, isn't this exciting?
Hey everyone, welcome to Journey to the Stage, and a very warm welcome to anybody tuning in for the first time. Journey to the Stage is the podcast home for music icons and indie artists from across styles, across genres, and across eras. I'm really jazzed to have our guest today. Bear McCreary is my very special guest. Before we start our conversation, if you would take a few seconds and subscribe to Journey to the Stage or follow wherever you're catching this, leave a kind review or throw some stars my way. Those things are such a huge help and always an encouragement to me. As somebody who loves the music of film and more broadly the music of media, it's a real honor for me to have Bear as my guest today. Bear is a multi-instrumentalist, a songwriter. His awards and nominations are voluminous, my goodness, and the span of his work in video game scoring, television, and film, and is one of the most sought-after composers in Hollywood. Beyond all that, Bear is a genuinely kind and nice human being, which carries a lot of weight in my book. I've been a fan of his work since the first time I heard the theme for The Walking Dead, which is probably one of the most evocative and chilling pieces I've heard. Bear, it is a real pleasure to have you on Journey to the Stage. Welcome.
Thanks, Brian. I'm excited.
Yeah, we had a chance to meet. I guess it was about 5 or 6 weeks ago. Time kind of flies. I was at the Singularity release concert that you did out in the Fonda Theater in LA, and you were so kind. After I was hanging out, I wanted to meet you and invite you to join me here. And as we mentioned before we started recording, I'm sure you were just wiped out. I'm sure that was such a long day, and you were so kind to come over and say hey and chat for a bit. So thanks for showing kindness to somebody who's a fan of your work. I appreciate that.
Well, thanks for coming to the show. It was really fun. I was really hoping to meet people, and I really enjoyed connecting with fans and other musicians that came. It was the whole point in making the Singularity as my debut rock album, a concept album even, was to collaborate and meet people. I mean, I've spent the last 20 years of my life doing music for media, which is awesome, and I love it. But there is a sort of isolating part of that job. I spend 18 hours a day sometimes in my studio, and I don't get to be there when people enjoy the music as the finished product. And it really got me itching to play live again, which I had done a lot of about 10 years ago. So, I had a blast, and you guys were waiting out there, and I thought, well, if they're waiting, I'm going to go say hi.
That was super cool of you. And, I do want to give a big thank you to Joe Augustine and the rest of your team for making this happen. I think people who are kind-hearted and nice like to surround themselves with like-minded people. And Joe was just so nice to me that night and has continued to be just as we got this set up. So you've got a good team around you. It's reflective of who you are. So I think that's super cool. So you've got a brand new album, The Singularity, which is a powerhouse of an album. Somebody who grew up through the 80s and 90s, just that power rock it's so good. And we're going to spend some time talking about that in a few minutes. But I thought it'd be kind of cool to maybe pan back a little bit and look at some parts of your story that I think are really, really interesting. So both you and your brother Brendan, have careers in music with really great diversity, as we were just talking about. Your brother obviously is on the album. He was with you on stage, can sing rock like just a beast. He's so powerful vocally, but also can be a crooner. But you also have that wide-ranging musical palette. I'm curious where that comes from. What was it maybe in your youth that kind of helped you have such a wide musical taste and variety? And anything that in those days that sparked that for you?
When I was 5, I discovered film music. Was in the theater seeing Back to the Future, and I heard Alan Silvestri's thunderous, adventurous score. And I made my mom bring me back the next night. I had a little Fisher-Price cassette recorder, and I held it up above my head so I could listen to that music again. And I was so annoyed that the dialogue and sound effects and the audience laughing were all on this recording. Well, then I discovered soundtracks that got rid of all that stuff. I loved movie music. I loved the music of Danny Elfman and John Williams and Jerry Goldsmith and Elmer Bernstein. Even that group that I just listed is a very diverse set of sounds, although it's all in this sort of broader cinematic context. I didn't listen to pop music or rock music or music with a vocal in it for nearly 10 years. I was a teenager when I stepped away from film music. And the only reason I did is I saw movies like Highlander and Flash Gordon, and I heard Queen. I found out that my favorite film composer, Danny Elfman, had a band, Oingo Boingo. What's that? I saw a movie called The Wall. Well, what's Pink Floyd? From there, I even heard, I would go see like Terminator 2, and I would hear You Could Be Mine by Guns N' Roses. I'm a hop, skip, and a jump away to November Rain. Well, this is all film music to me. Bohemian Rhapsody, November Rain. I realize like rock music and pop can have the kind of epic emotion and power that I loved in film music. But I think as a long-winded way of answering your question, why was I into diverse music? Music had to be diverse to get my attention. It wasn't like I started listening to the radio or popular music and then slowly branched out. I went the other way around. And so the very beginnings, that formative age from sort of 5 to 12, all I listened to was music from movies. And that tended to be orchestral, but also weird scores like Pee-wee's Big Adventure or Beetlejuice. I was fascinated by the dramatic potential of music.
Oh, that's really, really cool. You named some, of course, monumental composers, and very similarly, I was born, I'm a little older than you. I was born in 1970. So growing up on like Star Wars and Star Trek, the Star Trek movie is a little bit later. And I got captured by some of those early composers as well. And that's really interesting that is what captured you first. I kind of came the other way around. Are there particular scores that just really maybe hit you harder than others? Like,
absolutely,
really stayed with you.
I don't think any would surprise anybody that knows my music. Conan the Barbarian by Basil Polidorus is massively influential on me. I still listen to it. I still watch the movie and savor how well written it is. You already mentioned Star Trek: The Motion Picture by Jerry Goldsmith. Powerhouse writing. Many John Williams scores. I'm partial to The Empire Strikes Back. Danny Elfman, I already mentioned. Pee-wee and Beetlejuice. Edward Scissorhands was also there. When I got a little older, I went back and I listened to the composers that influenced them. And that's when I really discovered Bernard Herrmann, Nino Rota, Ennio Morricone. Elmer Bernstein's To Kill a Mockingbird is up there. And then I started to understand the tradition, the lineage, right, that Bernard Herrmann had a huge influence on not only Danny Elfman, but on Elmer Bernstein, on John Williams, and Ennio Morricone, the most prolific film composer to have ever lived, that he was so inventive, so resourceful, that he created new genres of music that became pillars of popular culture. I mean, I don't want to compare the greats, but truly, John Williams decided to take the music of his youth and put it in Star Wars. He didn't invent anything. That's what movies sounded like in the 30s and 40s. And so he just brought it back. Ennio Morricone was like a madman. He was doing things that had never been done, and they became cliches such that children know them now. So that's, to me, that those are the kinds of things that I became fascinated with when I got just a little older. When I was in high school, I could look back on scores like The Godfather and Once Upon a Time in the West, or The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, and realize, like, wow, these scores influenced the composers that I grew up thinking were amazing, and they are, but that there's a tradition that goes back and that they were part of that tradition. And in a way, I embrace that now. I borrow from every composer I just said and pull them into my own work and combine them into my metal record. I hear all those influences there. And that's one of the things that I loved about film music, is that it really wears on its sleeve the homage to the past. I think because film is so collaborative, you end up sharing these common references. And so you get a thing like Star Wars, which itself is definitive, but what it actually is Kurosawa movies meets the serials from the 40s. Lucas was making what he grew up on, and John Williams wrote the music that he grew up on. And that shared cultural touchstone is where this new art came from.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because even in ancient Roman art, in old Roman art, they would call it quoting. The artists they were quoting those that had gone before them, and it was really a way to show homage and to give reverence to those that had come before. I was just watching an interview with John Williams, and he talked about, he's getting up there and he's still creative, still well, but he said that he regrets the fact basically that he won't be around to hear where the medium is going to go, because the music of film is relatively young, and he wants to see how it's going to continue to develop, and he just is bummed about the fact that he won't be able to. In the time that you've been doing this and looking at some of those composers that you look to, how has the music of media or film in general changed over time? You and I talked about Elmer Bernstein when we chatted a few weeks ago, and his impact on that. He's a pivotal figure. How have you seen some of that development over time?
The technology and tastes change basically on a daily basis. And of course, they evolved from the 30s to the 40s to the 50s. Elmer wrote arguably the first jazz score with The Man with the Golden Arm. Man with the Golden Arm is a Frank Sinatra film about a jazz drummer. So it might surprise your listeners to think, well, of course, the movie about a jazz drummer would have a jazz score. Not then. Back then, every film had a symphonic, European, classical score. End of story. So Elmer shook things up. And yet by the time I met him, he had become the institution. He had not only written the Ten Commandments and The Great Escape and The Magnificent Seven, he wrote Ghostbusters and Spies Like Us and cheeseball comedies of the 80s. He had reinvented himself so many times. So with that in mind, I look at how the art has evolved over the course of my career. I entered the business adoring all those composers I mentioned. I would say that those composers, I don't hear them having a direct, huge influence on what is being done today. Film continues to evolve, so that makes sense. In a way, I try not to think about it, because I find, honestly, as a contributor to film and television and video games, I don't get inspired by pursuing what I hear someone doing right now. I enjoy hearing new sounds and new techniques, and I admire them. But when I sit down in my studio and I think I have to tell a story, I fall back on those techniques that excite me and inspire me. So I tend to go back to the things I loved when I was a kid, and I modernize them in my way. But I think it's sort of a philosophical approach, right? Like, is it my job to write movies that sound like they are 2024, or which you could make that argument, or is it really my job is to tell the story in the best way that I can with the tools that I have? And the most important tool any filmmaker or storyteller would have when they hire me is my enthusiasm. So I get very enthusiastic about being able to draw from all these different things. And in many ways, I'm dancing around the question you haven't asked yet. Well, why make the singularity? If you get to do all that stuff in film and TV and video games, and of course that is ultimately the answer, where I wanted to combine all of the things that I loved when I was a kid, and that includes heavy metal and rock.
Yeah, that's so cool. Yeah, we'll definitely spend some time talking about it. I personally think that some of the most beautiful music being made today is made for film. And something I really started getting to, I was a little older than you were, but I was in my early 20s when I really, really got captured and would focus on certain composers. Because I look at a piece like, Rosalind and Adama or Galadriel, pieces that can honestly bring me to tears because of the beauty of it. What is it about a piece of music you think, as a creator of that, as somebody who composes, what do you think it is about a piece that can really get to the depth of a person like few things can, that can be so emotionally evocative? I realize that's maybe an impossible question, but how do you think a piece maybe like Galadriel can really get to a person emotionally?
I don't think that's a difficult question at all. I think that it's melody, melody, melody. Melody is the key to bypassing your mental defenses. Our brain doesn't want us to be upset, right? Like our brain understands we're looking at a screen. Our brain understands these people aren't real. Music bypasses all that. And to me, the most essential tool in that toolkit is melody. I'm not saying it's the only way. I'm just saying it's the most efficient and most effective. And the less melody a piece of music has, the more context is required for you to have an emotional response. I would say, I've written some very ambient pieces for The Walking Dead, for example. And people tell me, oh, The Mercy of the Living is so emotional, and I appreciate that. However, I believe it is their contextual memory of the show. They hear those ambient chords, and their brain is pulling things together, and then they get emotional. Whereas there are pieces of music that Ennio Morricone wrote for movies I've never seen. I get emotional because the melody provides this contextual framework. And when that melody is that strong, I can't help but start associating my own life experiences. Heartbreak and loss or joy.
Sure.
A good piece of music disarms you and your brain starts associating emotions with it. And so for me, melody is the way to do that. And I write melodically as often as I can.
That's incredible. I had read that really early on you were writing your own scripts so you could write music for them. I think that's pretty cool, which, as when we talk about Singularity, we'll tie all of that together. And it was really in those early days when you met Elmer Bernstein. I would love to hear you. I know you've told the story before, but it was very much just kind of a random chance. Well, I would say, or not, very serendipitous, we might say.
Yeah.
But talk about that, because to me, that was a life-changing moment for you.
It absolutely was. I was writing film style music every day. This was in high school. By this point, starting in 8th grade, I got a little keyboard with a sequencer. And by 9th grade, I got a computer with sequencing software. So I could really start composing the music that I wanted to pull out of my brain, and I recorded it. My junior year, I was student of the month at the local Rotary Club, and they pulled me up at this luncheon in front of all these old guys, and they said, this is Bear McCreary. He is a junior at Bellingham High School. He wants to go to USC and study film scoring when he goes to college. And it was super boring. Honestly, I couldn't wait to get back to high school. But this guy comes up to me, this guy named Joe Coons, introduces himself and says that he runs the local boating association. Bellingham, Washington is a harbor town. One of the last cities before you get to Canada on the Pacific Northwest coast. He says he has a friend in the business. Have you heard of Elmer Bernstein? He says to me. Oh, my jaw hits the floor. What? Turns out Elmer kept a sailboat in Bellingham, Washington. And that every summer he would get on the boat, sail up the coast, up to Alaska and back. And that he kept it in the harbor there and knew this guy, Joe. Joe volunteered to give Elmer a cassette of my music to send it to him. I would later find out Elmer would get cassettes all the time, and he'd never listen to them. He listened to this one. And the next time he was in town, that spring, the end of my junior year in high school, I met him on his boat. And he was gracious and generous. He said he listened to my music, and he said he kept saying it had so much character. It had so much character. And he asked me, have you studied composition? No. Harmony? No. Theory? Counterpoint? Conducting? Orchestration? Anything? And I said, no. I take piano lessons, and I play in my jazz band at high school, and I play in a rock band with my friends. And Elmer said, basically, you have to be this tall to get on the ride. You've got to know these things. So, obviously, Jerry Goldsmith knows those things, and John Williams knows those things. And Elmer Bernstein is telling me I got to know those things. So I said, well, then, tell me where to sign up. And he recommended I come to USC, which I did. And not only went in their film scoring program, I went in their classical composition program. I was there for 5 years, learning all those things. Yeah. And I ended up working for him for the better part of a decade. I started off as an assistant doing MIDI cleanup, and then one summer I organized his entire catalog of everything that was in his closet: scores, parts, articles. Oh, wow. And every day he would leave me in there for 6-7 hours a day. I would come back, he would come back, and I would have piles. Oh, this was from To Kill a Mockingbird. This was a letter from Cecil B. DeMille. This was a letter from Donald Fagen. That must have been part of heavy metal, right? But there'd be other things that I didn't know. And he would sit down and go, oh, this was a cue from, and then he would tell me an amazing story that would come back to him. So I started leaving things out, even though I knew what they were. So I left out the main title opening cue of Ghostbusters. I knew what it was. I could see the GB up top. I could read the music enough to know what it was, but I go, what is this? And he's like, oh, that's Ghostbusters. And I go, what is that thing right there? And I point to it. Oh, that's the Onde Martineau. And then I would get the whole story of that weird sound that goes, what that is. It was in all his scores in the 80s. Well, I got the story because I left that score out to get the story. And then my last summer working with him, he was traveling again over the summer. He really needed someone to house sit his dogs and stay at his house in Santa Barbara and give the dogs their medicine. I would have done that happily. He also gave me a score to orchestrate. There was a score to a Yul Brynner movie, 1968, called Kings of the Sun. The scores had been lost. The original tapes had been destroyed. The only thing that existed of his music was his handwritten sketches. So Elmer Bernstein said to me, orchestrate this movie again, and I will re-record it, And then, so think about this as a masterclass in film orchestration.
Oh
I
my.
orchestrated the entire movie from scratch. Then when he came back, he sat down with a red pen and showed me what I got wrong.
What a story. So you were like literally a kid in a candy shop. I mean, you're walking into this cave of wonders, not and then having access to the guy who buried all that treasure. How
And his Oscars were up.
wow.
His Oscar was up on the wall. I could pull down any score that I wanted and look at it. And I spent so much time doing that. There were DAT tapes of various sessions, all his sessions. I could go listen to the recording sessions of Animal House, or anything. And I learned, but what was most interesting is I learned from him, to go back to what you were asking me about how things change. What I learned from Elmer Bernstein's what doesn't change, which is the art of storytelling with music. We are all doing the same thing. It doesn't matter what the genre is or what the technology allows. At the end of the day, I need to sit down with a storyteller in 2024 and ask the same questions that Elmer Bernstein as a young man asked to Otto Preminger or Cecil B. DeMille. It's the same questions. And realizing that, learning from him what it means to be a filmmaker, and I will broaden out and just say a storyteller, because I also apply this to video games, television.
Absolutely.
That changed my life and gave me a sense of focus and priority. And as I entered the business then, a year or two later, I would go to meetings of young composers, other people my age, and I would hear them talking, asking questions. What sample libraries do you use? What software do you use? And I looked at them like they had holes in their head. Like, who cares? That doesn't matter. And I realized, only looking back, it was because of my time with Elmer that I got to learn that I didn't get an immediate fixation on software, on deadlines, on how do you produce music, what do you do about temp scores, everything everybody panics about. And these are real concerns. I don't mean to downplay them. But because of the years I spent with Elmer when I was a teenager, up till about 21, 22, I realized it's about those relationships, collaboration,
Right.
being a storyteller first, and ultimately looking at a man whose life I wanted to emulate because he was happy. He had kids who liked him and a family who liked him. People in the industry adored him. As a teenager, I didn't know any film composers. I grew up in Bellingham, Washington. John Williams was a name on a screen. When I met Elmer Bernstein, it made me feel a sense of direction that I needed. And I still lean on that every day. I would love to have that kind of life and have that kind of impact on the people around me that Elmer had on me. So he really did change my life. And just to be clear, he did not start my career at all. It was really learning about the art and learning about what I wanted out of my life that I got from Elmer Bernstein.
That's incredible. One of my past guests, Sally Stevens, Ron Hicklin, both worked with Elmer and worked with Williams and Horner and Goldsmith, Elfman, anyone you can think of. But they talk about, I was just communicating with Sally about Elmer last night and said he was wonderful to work with. So he had that reputation in the industry. And I'm sure there are people who don't. Some people may be more difficult to work with, but he was a delight from what people said. So when you graduated, one of the first things that you got commissioned to do was Battlestar Galactica, which, in my generation, as I mentioned, I'm a little bit older than you. I grew up watching Battlestar Galactica, the original series. So, and I had read that Elmer passed away on the day that you started writing that. Emotionally, what was that for you? Was that, I can't imagine how difficult that would have been. Just kind of walk us through how you got that project and were you setting to honor your mentor in a way with the work that you did in that particular? Because you did a lot of work in there.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I try to honor him and the influence he had on me with everything that I do. The man who introduced me, Joe Coons, got an autographed CD of every album I ever made during his lifetime, and then his widow got them after that. I mean, I must have sent 100 CDs up there. So I'm very grateful for that. I said I didn't learn anything really about the business from Elmer, and I learned that from Richard Gibbs, my first job out of college. Richard Gibbs, ironically, a keyboard player from Boingo Boingo, and I know all those other guys too. Coincidence?
Yeah.
Was the composer of the Battlestar Galactica miniseries. I'd been working with him, Richard Gibbs, a younger composer, obviously, than Elmer, older than me, but he was part of the generation that dealt with temp scores and dealt with the technology, and he was a keyboard guy, so he had sequencers and computers. It was the perfect yin-yang scenario. I learned everything working with Richard Gibbs that I did not learn working with Elmer Bernstein. Sequencing in Pro Tools and click tracks and time code and all that, and dealing with music editors and dealing with finicky directors and studios. I mean, Elmer was in a different stratosphere that no one else will ever be in. So with that said, Richard did the miniseries of Battlestar Galactica. I was fortunate enough to write additional music on that. And when the time came to go to series, I had the opportunity to be the composer of a couple episodes while they looked for someone real. You would never have a 24-year-old child score your big budget, for Sci-Fi Channel, big budget television show. And yes, the day I started writing, knowing that the credit would say music by Bear McCreary for the first time on a mainstream project, that was the day Elmer died. And I only found that out because I shut my cell phone off to write all day. And I turned it back on and had 18 voice messages. That was devastating because I didn't tell Elmer I was probably going to get Battlestar Galactica. I waited. I talked with him 2 weeks earlier. I spoke with him 2 weeks earlier and didn't tell him. He knew that I had worked on the miniseries, that Battlestar was floating around as a possibility, but I definitely learned don't sit on good news. However, with that said, in speaking with his assistant and his children and his widow, everybody said to me permutations of the same thing, that any time I came up, Elmer would always say, with regard to me, you don't need to worry about Bear. Bear's going to be fine. So I like to think that he somehow saw that something was going to happen for me. And truly, I don't know how he saw that, Brian. And he heard it in the cassette tape that Joe Coons sent him. The cassette tape that he wouldn't listen to others. He listened to that one. I don't know what he heard. I don't know what he saw in me, but he heard and saw something. And in many ways, that has been at the core of the way I try to operate with people who help me, with younger composers. I've recently made a switch where many, if actually most of my television credits now say music by Sparks and Shadows, my studio. Yeah. Themes by Bear McCreary. This is all inspired by Elmer. That it's like I feel this feeling that I want to be grateful for what he did for me, and I want to help other people that are now in a position where I can help them. It's odd for me to even come to terms with that I've been doing this long enough. That's the position I'm in now. I'm not the kid anymore. And I want to be able to share more credit. I want to be able to teach people how to write the way that I write. And that's what I've done at Sparks and Shadows. These are not rando contractors. Many of these people have worked with me for years, a couple for a decade, and they write music the way that I do, and I teach them the way Elmer taught me, which is story first. So in that way, I tried to pay back to the universe what the gift that Elmer Bernstein was.
I think that's incredible. And that, to me, that's such a microcosm of life. You know, we're all helped up by somebody to varying degrees, while at the same time we're helping somebody else up. I think that is really, really cool. And I'm glad you brought up Sparks and Shadows, because clearly you saw the value of being mentored and have now taken it upon yourself to do the same thing. I think that's really outstanding, because if you think about it, you're creating some of your own competition, but you don't see it that way. You see it as you're investing in a generation. You know what I mean? And I think that's very admirable. And do you find yourself
I also like being upfront, right? That like I am scoring a bunch of TV shows, and now people know I've spent the last 5 years collaborating with Slash and Rufus Wainwright and Serj Tankian and Corey Taylor. Like, that obviously took a lot of time, okay? So at a certain point, I realized this is silly, having 6 television shows on the air that say music by Bear McCreary. What does that really mean? Like, I wrote the themes. I scored the first episode. At a certain point, my staff helps me, and I'm proud of them. And I want the showrunners to be proud of them. I want fans to be proud of them. And I'm proud of what I did. You look at Percy Jackson and the Olympians, it says themes by Bear, music by Sparks and Shadows. I'm proud of those themes. And I'm not, that's not a thing I'm ashamed of. I love that Sparks and Shadows did all that great work. Conversely, you look at The Lord of the Rings of Power, that says music by Bear McCreary. That's what that means. I wrote 8 hours on season 1, 9 hours on season 1. I just finished 8 hours on season 2. And I realized that if I want that to mean something, that I wrote every single cue in that show, there's no additional music credit, that's me. But if I want to say that with a straight face, I had to shift the way I did everything else. And I looked back to Elmer to really do that and think about how in the modern era, we talked about what's changed. Television has changed. The way composers write has changed. People get hired and then are expected to produce 9 to 16 hours of high quality score on a budget that doesn't pay your bills. Okay, think about that. It's like you have to cobble together multiple shows. That's why ultimately there's a whole ecosystem where there's the people that get the job because of the name recognition and the brand and the good work. And then they have people that help them. Well, I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that that's the model in television, right?
Yeah.
And so I did something that very few other people have done. I don't want to say no one's ever done, but I do believe it's the future. I do believe that it's the way things should be done. And I'm proud of that.
That's super cool. So as a dad, every once in a while, I will hear my dad coming out in the way I, talk to my sons. I'm like, oh man, my dad used to say that. As you are mentoring some of these up and coming, these younger composers, do you hear Elmer coming out like, okay, that's an Elmerism, or that's something I got from? Do you ever have those moments?
Sometimes. There's one thing for sure. I use it all the time. And it's not that it slips out like you're talking, like the dadisms slip out. This is a secret weapon that I have in my Batman utility belt. Anytime I get in trouble with a filmmaker, anytime I get confused, anytime I'm working with someone at Sparks and Shadows and I feel like they might be confused, Elmer taught me something that he learned working with John Sturgis and Otto Preminger and Cecil B. DeMille. These are basics, right? There's only one thing that you need to ask a filmmaker. Fundamentally, there's only one thing you need to understand to do this job. The question is, what do you want the audience to feel?
Wow.
That's it. If a filmmaker starts talking about the temp, is that a clarinet? Well, I don't like clarinets. It should be funny, but could it be a little purple? You hear all kinds of stuff. If you ask them, what do you want the audience to feel? almost all the time, the truth comes out immediately. Fundamentally, that's their job. That's their only job. They don't need to talk about music. They don't need to talk about editing. They don't need to talk about lighting. They, meaning the director or the showrunner, is an avatar for the audience. What do you want the audience to feel? When you tell me that, I can do that for you with the tools that I have. You don't need to micromanage me. Now I know what to do. And similarly, when my composers are trying to write a cue and I'm going over it with them, which I do at length, and they don't understand or they aren't writing something that I understand, I'll ask them, what do you want the audience to feel? And most of the time, that question, if they're not writing music that tells me that, it reveals the truth that they hadn't thought of it that way. And their answer gets super complicated. It's usually a one-sentence answer, right? I mean, this is very simple, basic stuff. And every frame of footage, you can pause it and you can ask everybody in the room, what do we want the audience to feel here? And I have been bailed out of so many jams. Anytime things start going south, that's my secret weapon, and I learned it from Elmer.
That's incredible. And before we get to Singularity, that's a great story, and I think that's very, very telling. Last thing I want to ask you before we get into Singularity is, as a composer who was that up-and-coming guy to somebody who has so many projects, so many deadlines, how emotionally, mentally do you keep yourself creative while at the same time feeling the pressure of a deadline, of pleasing a director, a producer? How do you manage all of that? Because it seems like so much of it we can get in our own heads, and I know I can be my own worst enemy and things like that, but how do you navigate those two things, creativity and the need to produce on deadline?
The ability to block out those kinds of pressures is vital to do my job. If I'm feeling the pressure, I'm not going to do a good job. So the short answer is I don't worry about it because I can't. My job is to come into my studio and become a child again and have fun doing this, and that will translate. Now, when you collaborate with people, and then the challenge is not me bringing up some emotional childhood memories and having fun with them or being terrified by them or whatever that emotion. Once there's another person involved, that's where you start losing control. Because now I've got to make that other person happy. And if that other person takes so long, so many drafts, that the deadline is going to be a factor. I know how fast I can write music, right? I don't know how fast I can make you like my music. I don't know that.
Right.
That is where having my team at Sparks and Shadows comes in. That's why I have them. Because once things start to get a little crazy, and I realize I don't know what this person wants, I'm not passing a judgment. I'm saying I don't know what it is. The best way to figure out what they want is to start showing them multiple things. If they can't answer an essay question, you give them multiple choice questions, right? So the next thing I say is I go, okay, well, I'm not sure if we're not sure if it's supposed to be funny or scary, let me try a couple of different versions. And you know what? Getting a little short on time, I'll send them to you tomorrow. All right, how do you write 2 brand new versions tomorrow? And by the way, I'm not sounding stressed. I'm not gritting my teeth. I don't look like I'm judging this person for ostensibly like I'd have to stay up all night, right? No. That's where Sparks and Shadows comes in. I call my composers and I go, okay, gang, here's what we got to do. I need your help. You write a funny version. You write a scary version. You write a different version. Just let's see if something else sticks, right? Then it becomes a group effort. And most of the time, this is a team sport, okay? Most of the time, that is what it takes. More often than not, that is what it takes. The reason that I can do the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power, I can write 9 hours in 9 months, is that I rarely go to version 3 with my showrunners. Most of the time, version 2 is the one, and it's small tweaks. It just is a coincidence. It just means they happen to want what I happen to think is my first pass. Because of that constellation of personalities, I can write it all. But that's the only reason. It's not because of anything other than that. So that's how I just almost obstinately refuse to end up in a situation where I get angry or frustrated. Like, if you want me to write this 10 different ways, I'm not going to be upset about that. I will get 5 different people to write 2 drafts, and the next time you see me, I've got a smile on my face, and I'm personally curious and excited to look at 10 versions of this cue. If that's what you need, we're going to do that. And so that's the way I think I've managed my career, which is, it's almost like having 2 modes, right? There's the mode where I'm going to do every single second of this, or the mode where I'm leading a team and we're all working on it together. No judgment, whichever one suits you better as a client, that's the one I'm going to do.
That's incredible. Well, it sounds like you found a way to make it work for you. That's really cool. I want to talk about Singularity. This is a powerhouse of a rock album. I mean, it's rock, but let's be honest. There's so much stylistically cross genres going on this album. It's like 24, 25 songs. It is an epic tale. So you've been a storyteller, really your whole life, pretty much. Take us back to the origin of this epic tale, because I remember when I was at the concert, you talked about this one. I started writing when I was 16. So there's some history. Kind of walk us through where this epic story started and how it developed over time.
Yeah, there's a track on my new record called Escape from the Machines. When you listen to that track, the first 15 seconds are a recording from 1995. I was 15 years old. It was on a Tascam 4-track cassette recorder, and the guitar you're hearing is my friend, who's now a producer, named Malay. We were recording in his bedroom up in Bellingham, Washington. Then 10 or 15 seconds in, you hear Gene Hoglan on drums kick in, and then that same guitar riff that I wrote when I was 15, Slash comes in playing it. And then Joe Satriani does the solo. So that is how long I've been working with personally experimenting with hard rock. And not just hard rock, but hard rock that is specifically narrative. It's called Escape from the Machines because when I was 15, I was imagining like the Terminator Future War, right? I was imagining a cyberpunk cue from a movie. I wasn't trying to write a rock song. I was trying to write a film cue. So my love of rock came from that. And finally, 5 years ago, I realized that I had more that I wanted to say. I mentioned earlier about techniques that I use to ensure that I don't become a bitter person working in Hollywood. I realized that one of the things I would need to do in order to prevent that fate from occurring was I had to pursue my own creative voice. Because I started to feel that my clients that were coming to me with their projects, I would have ideas of things I wanted to do. And then when they didn't want to do them, I was feeling like they were taking something from me. My enthusiasm was going away because I wanted to do this thing. Well, I realized that's not their fault. That's my fault. I needed to make my own framework and then do that scary moment of looking in the mirror and saying to myself, if I'm an artist, truly, if I have something to say, then I need to say it, or I need to just shut up and smile and write everything everybody's asking me to write and not be mad at them, right? When I did that, my life got so much better. I mean, my happiness in every degree went skyrocketing because now anything that came from my film scoring career, video games, television, is icing on the cake. I'm happy to do whatever they want because over here I'm doing what I want, what I feel like I need to say. And I realize what I need to say involves cinematic, symphonic, hard rock and metal. And it allowed me to take all the things that I've learned about storytelling and flip it on its head. For the last 20 years, I've been writing music for other people's stories. Well, now I wrote the music first. I dug deep and discovered what I had to say. And then I realized, just because of who I am, there's a story in there. And so I decided to collaborate with some of my friends in the comic book industry, and we made a graphic novel and converted this series of songs into a concept album. And then I started writing more songs drawn from the graphic novel, and it became a fully collaborative narrative experience.
That's so cool.
Which is funny. Now I wonder if people assume, because I am a film score guy and video game guy, that I wrote a story and wrote music for it. You pointed out I even did that in high school. I've already done that. No, the Singularity was music first. And then I realized it had this narrative in it.
That is so cool. And there are some songs. I mean, I love concept albums. There are a couple of favorites on there. The End of Tomorrow and I'm so glad you did this live, because that song, I will be humming that all day long, especially those last few minutes. But I think the most beautiful song on that is the one your wife sings on it. I don't even know if Antikythera Mechanism. Is that how you say that?
You got it.
Okay. Beautiful. That melody and your wife's vocal delivery on that are hauntingly beautiful. It is, to me, that is like the crown jewel of that, because here you have all this, in some cases, blistering rock, this great, powerful music, but there's this moment where you let your listener come up for a breath, and it's like just looking around a room filled with beauty. It is a magnificent song. That very, very well done. And your wife just live, it was so great. I was right up against the barrier and saw it. It was so beautiful. You feel good about how it turned out. Are you good with the finished product?
I'm thrilled, and Rhea wrote those lyrics too. She wrote an incredible lyric for that melody, which is it was amazing getting to collaborate with her. And I started collaborating with people because I sing a lot of the backing vocals, but I'm not a lead singer. So obviously the first step when I decided to write a rock record is to find some people that can sing. I started with my brother, who sings about half the songs on the record. He co-wrote, co-produced. Then I wanted to bring in Rhea, and together we wrote Antikythera Mechanism. Then it just started to happen organically. I work with this singer named Ivor on God of War and God of War Ragnarok. I brought her in. Yeah. And then there's this singer named Griager who can rap in Gaelic. So I've got to have Gaelic rapping on my record. Well, by that point, and then I brought in Morgan Sorn, who sings the last song. He does these incredible layers with his voice. Well, by that point, I then reached out to my friend Serj Tankian from System of a Down. I thought maybe he'd be interested, and he jumped at the first song, one of the most intense songs on the record. Well, then that just blew the doors wide open. I thought, well, now that I've got Serj, why don't I reach out to other people that I don't necessarily know? I reached out to Rufus Wainwright. I reached out to Corey Taylor from Slipknot, Jens Kidman from the extreme metal band Meshuggah. I hooked up with Kim Thale from Soundgarden, and Scott Ian from Anthrax, and Guthrie Govan from the Aristocrats, and Buck Dharma from Blue Oyster Cult. It just kept ballooning. A rapper, a nerdcore rapper named Megaran. There were so many amazing artists that after a while, it was just so much fun to see who else might want to be on the record. And then that culminated, I've already mentioned Joe Satriani. The last person was Slash. And I reached out to Slash to do The End of Tomorrow. And that went so well, I brought him back to do Escape from the Machines. But that, what was so amazing about the Singularity, I started to do it only because I wanted to have fun. That was it. I wanted to feel good. I wanted to say something, and I wanted to have fun. It's self-financed. It is my project. I control it. And then I started reaching out to other people. And for people that are like Serj and Slash and Rufus and all these famous artists that are on my record, there is no reason for them to be on the Singularity unless they like the music and enjoy being around me. So in a weird way, it brought so much positivity into my life because there were artists I reached out to who just very politely said no. But it was almost like a filter, right? Like the people that said yes tend to be the kind of people then that are going to hang out and be enthusiastic and then be in the live show. I mean, I had Buck Dharma and Slash together on stage at the Fonda Theater, and Osdru Sierra from Ozo Motley. Many of these people were and are my heroes. So the Singularity became something bigger than I ever expected. I never dared to dream when I decided to write a rock record, not being known as a rock artist at all, that I would have people like that involved or that it would turn out so good. I'm just so proud of it. But it really was an organic process. And I think you can hear in the writing, in the contributions from everybody, a sense of enthusiasm, right? That's why they're all there. So I'm really fond of the record, man. I want it to be a part of my life moving forward.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important for you. You have lots of creative opportunities, but to be able to tell your story your way on your timetable, I would think would be so enriching for you. And just to have that experience with all these wonderful musicians, that stage was packed with so much talent. In fact, I should send some pictures over to Joe because I was right up front. I know you guys had a photographer there, but I got some great pictures. I got a picture of Slash that is so cool. It's just his silhouette behind, and it is just one of the neatest shots I got. So I'll send that over to Joe. Well, Bear, I know you've got to get on with your day. I'm so incredibly grateful. This has been a fascinating conversation. I'm so grateful that you gave me your time, and thanks for hanging out with me this afternoon.
Thanks, man. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for being there. And truly, thank you for the insightful questions that go back further than many people want to go back. I really love being able to talk about my time with Elmer. That was really great.
Yeah, I love that too. And, one other thing I was thinking about in the song that your wife sings, there's this moment, there's a little bit of a violin part that is evocative of the Walking Dead, that rolling. I'm like, wait a minute. It's almost like a quote from just a hint here and there. I'm like, wait, Walking Dead reference, almost, not a reference, but I love that you did that. I love that violin part in the Walking Dead. So
well, that's
cool.
That's very me. I love those kind of rippling string lines. And
so chilling.
And that's what I think makes the record kind of unique, because I'm coming to rock with a fairly robust couple of decades of orchestral knowledge under my belt. Right. It's not like, and I love it when Pink Floyd and Queen and Guns N' Roses, work with orchestral arrangers and orchestras involved. But there is a difference in writing a song on piano or guitar and putting orchestra on it. And I feel like that is one of the things that makes me special. It took me, 30 years of writing orchestral music to kind of learn how to do that, Brian, right? So it's fun that you would even pick up on that, because I believe it's things like that, which may not be the loudest or the most aggressive or the most showy, but those are the things that kind of only show up in a project like this, where you've got to know enough about orchestra to even know that that's possible, and then leave space for it in the song.
Mm-hmm. Well, subtlety in itself is an art form. So I love that it's really kind of tucked in the mix. You're like, oh, wait a minute, what was that? And everyone, I'm like, oh, okay. It's just like this moment of discovery. So I'm so glad you did that. Well, Bear, thank you again. It's been such a blast talking to you. And for everybody listening, if you've enjoyed this conversation, share it with others. Leave a kind review. Throw some stars my way. Those things really are the currency of the modern age. So thank you for listening. And for all the guys out there, call your mom. She's missing you. And until then, keep your bags packed and join us on our next Journey to the Stage. And that is a wrap.